What's up YouTube, just a casual nerd here, back again with another video, and today we're going to talk about why I want Kang the Conqueror to win. Now I know, if you clicked on this video, you're probably thinking it was clickbait or that I'm crazy or something. Well, I come to assure you that it's neither of those two things. Well, what I'm about to tell you may sound a little crazy, but I promise you it's not crazy. Just stick with me. For those of you who don't know, Kang the Conqueror is basically like going to be the next big bad of the MCU as far as we know, since they haven't introduced Doctor Doom or anything yet. But basically like the next big bad, the same way that Thanos was in the first three phases. And he was kind of already introduced in the Loki series at the end, but it was a variant or a version of him, and his name was He Who Remains. Now, if you're not familiar with the character, I'll give my best synopsis. Again, I'm a casual, so I don't have the best comic book explanations for you guys. But basically, Kang, he's a time traveling villain who's basically at the end of time, probably in MCU at the end of time, but generally speaking, he's a time traveling villain who basically is conquering civilizations and universes because he has technology from like the 40th century or something like that, but he was born in the 30th century, and he's been repurposing older and new technology to basically conquer civilizations and defeat the Avengers. And because he's also, knowledgeable of all the history, he's able to know everyone's different weaknesses, and he's crafted this suit that's basically impenetrable by using different technology. He himself doesn't have any actual powers or abilities, but because he's able to time travel, he's able to kind of just basically get the best weapons and use those against any of his foes, as well as his knowledge of history in itself. So basically any current hero that we're currently aware of is basically almost like a non-threat to him, because he kind of looks at them almost as ants, because he's seen it all before. They're very, in his viewpoint, very historical, and he knows all of what they're capable of, and he already knows the outcome of certain events. So that's what makes him such a kind of a fearsome foe, whether he's facing the Avengers or Fantastic Four or basically any of the heroes in the Marvel universe. Now, with that out the way, I'm going to get to the more juicy stuff of why I actually want Kang to win in the MCU, okay? And that first reason is so that he can preserve the sacred timeline. All right, if you remember, if you watched the Loki series, or if you didn't, I'll give a quick kind of synopsis. Basically, Loki and Sylvie, which Sylvie is just Loki's variant, they killed, well, really, Sylvie, she killed He Who Remains, who was basically over the sacred timeline, make sure that there was only one timeline, and he was the Kang, or the version of Kang that was at the end, make sure that things didn't go out of place or go astray. And you did that through what was called the TVA, which is basically kind of like the timeline police. So when they killed He Who Remains, they created a lot more different timelines or multiverses, whatever you like to call them, but they created a whole bunch more of them. And instead of He Who Remains, who was basically just trying to keep everything in line, what the person who replaced him was, as we know, the villain Kang the Conqueror, who is just another version of He Who Remains, but supposed to be a more evil version. So here we are now in the MCU with now Kang the Conqueror over the quote-unquote timeline. Now, I know I'm going to lose a couple of you here, but I have to say I'm not a big fan of multiverse or timeline stories as it's used today. Now, I do think it's fun. I do like seeing different versions of characters. I think it's a fun thing to have. It can be very entertaining, but from a story perspective or a storytelling perspective, I think it hurts more than it helps. And what I mean by that is that when you have a multiverse or multiple timelines in any type of a story, whether that's Marvel or DC, basically once you introduce the multiverse, basically anything goes. Any problem that can be possibly solved has been solved in another universe. Anyone who may have died in one universe is alive in another universe. And when you introduce beings who can travel in between timelines or universe, basically it opens up the whole storyline being able to be solved by just going to a different universe or introducing some type of multiverse solution. Now, if you're telling like an isolated multiverse story, such as like if you recall the movie that came out this year, Everything Everywhere All at Once, if it's like an isolated thing, I think that's cool, and it's not the problem I'm thinking of. What I'm more so looking at is with the MCU, a universe, as far as we know, that's going to probably, keep going into the future until, Disney decides they don't want to milk this series anymore. But if we're going to kind of keep going in the future, then the multiverse is always going to be there, and it can always be used to be a cop out. Like even in the Doctor Strange movie, they had this book that could basically solve any of the issues, and it just so happened that there was only one of them, even though it was known to all these different multiverse beings. But even something like that, you can solve any problem that you have just by introducing the multiverse. And then again, it also renders characters dying not really meaning as much. Like, yeah, we may lose a character of our like main timeline that we know. Like say for example, if in the Ant-Man and Wasp film, Kang he kills Ant-Man or something like that, which is most likely not going to happen. But hypothetically speaking, if he kills Ant-Man, in the back of our minds, there's like there's like a million other versions of Ant-Mans out there in the multiverse, and some are not so different from our timeline that we're in currently. So if He Who Remains was telling the truth in the Loki series, that means that Kang is supposedly, taking his place, and therefore is trying to ensure that there's just one timeline again. Mainly so that he won't have to fight other Kangs. So there will just only be, the one Kang, which is Kang the Conqueror. And yes, his own reasoning for creating a sacred timeline would be very selfish. It does actually help the storytelling of the MCU, because then I feel like there will actually be consequences to actions that take place. Because think about Infinity War. Let's go back to Infinity War. At the end of that, you kind of really felt very kind of dismal. You really didn't know what the Avengers were going to do to undo the snap, and so there were emotions were high. You actually felt like there was like real consequences, which in Endgame they then created time travel, which allowed them to basically undo what had been done, which is okay, because in the, I guess, quote unquote sacred timeline, that was allowed under He Who Remains, so that part is okay. But the problem is, if there wasn't a sacred timeline, or there was no TVA, or there was no version of Kang at the end of the timeline, then they could have easily created multiple timelines just by going back in time. I mean, technically they almost did when Loki escaped, but of course, he was pruned so that extra or that new timeline wouldn't be created that was outside the sacred timeline. Because then there could be a universe where Tony wasn't the one who snapped his fingers at the end. Maybe, I don't know, Pepper did, and Tony ended up living. Or it wasn't Captain America who went to go take the time stones back. Maybe he sent Ant-Man to take the not time stones, the Infinity Stones back to their respectful places. So technically, with the multiverse, technically those scenarios most likely do exist. But if they do exist, then there are again no consequences, because there's always a different version somewhere else where certain acts or things that you didn't want to happen didn't happen elsewhere. So I just genuinely believe that stories need consequences in order for us to keep being invested into the story itself. Because if I know whatever happens to a character, that there's a slightly different version where that didn't happen to, or there's a cop out where a problem has already been solved elsewhere, so they can just use that knowledge to solve the problem. It kind of gives the story kind of a handicap, and doesn't let the characters themselves think about consequences and think about ways to solve their issues. But again, like I said before, I do think the multiverse is fun. It's fun to kind of think about. It's fun to see on screen at times, but for a universe, for like a gigantic universe like the MCU, I think it could be a hindrance. But again, in the isolated manners, I think it could be really fun. Like, look at everything everywhere at once. Even Into the Spider-Verse, technically he did use other multiverse versions of himself to solve his problems. So I guess you could argue that was a handicap, but again, that's more so it's been an isolated story and not a whole entire universe. So again, it can be fun, it can be a useful tool, but I think in this aspect, in the grand kind of scheme of the MCU, Kang will be useful in creating a new sacred timeline, so that for the future, the MCU, they can tell better stories and make sure that stories will always have some type of consequences at the end of the day. Which leads me to my next point, or my second and last reason why I want Kang the Conqueror to win, is the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. If you're familiar with that saying, it basically just means that the person that you know to be bad, or the person you know that's close to you, you already know their actions, is better than fooling with the person that you don't know what they're capable of, or if they're maybe worse than the person you're dealing with. And this is something that Sylvie, I don't think Sylvie really took that saying to heart back in the Loki series, because she's basically solely responsible for Kang the Conqueror, being the main villain now. If she didn't kill He Who Remains, then Kang the Conqueror wouldn't be a thing in the first place. Now, before y'all destroy me in the comments, I would much prefer He Who Remains over Kang the Conqueror, because He Who Remains at least didn't seem like he had, at least evil intent. Now, some of the things he did, of course, were questionable and kind of, ruined some people's lives, but I don't think he had the intent to really conquer, or people to, worship him or anything like that. But with that being said, since now we have to deal with Kang being over the TVA, who's to say if you kill Kang, or you defeat Kang, even worse version of Kang takes over. So we have, Kang Conqueror, his main thing right now may just be conquering, different civilizations or timelines. But who's to say that the next Kang or another Kang may be just more sadistic, or want to, eliminate certain individuals. Now, obviously, we don't know this current Kang's his current motivations that we're going to see in throughout the MCU, and all the way leading up to the Kang Dynasty, whenever that comes out. I don't remember which year it's coming out, so we don't know his exact motivations. So yes, I guess you could argue that he could be sadistic, but with that being said, who's to say? However bad he is, could there be someone even worse? I mean, we could have another Kang who decides to, I don't know, pluck the Hulk out of an end game, where before he snaps and brings people back, he like plucks them away, so that the rest of the universe, the other half of the universe, doesn't come back. And he could just do that just because he wants to. But so we don't know his motivations. But what we do know is what we currently see is still intact, because he wants it to be intact. Because as we saw in Loki, that Kang is already over this current TVA. So what we've seen so far in this phase 4, as far as we know, most things are intact. Now, obviously, that can change, but again, as far as we know, since he's currently over the timeline, nothing necessarily negative has really happened, or nothing out of the ordinary. Now, of course, you're probably going to see him either in Ant-Man or in the future movies, conquer whether it's different multiverses, or try to conquer different civilizations, or be over them. So I do plan to see that. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but who's to say if you take out Kang, then just another Kang who's, I don't know, a murderer, or who sees things in the future that just goes left, so he decides that he needs to I don't know, assassinate certain people, or he even is worse than Thanos and said, the planet will survive a lot longer if he annihilates 75% of the population at this certain, I don't know, century. So we don't know what other Kangs are thinking, but if you're dealing with this particular Kang who basically just wants to conquer, it'll be easier to deal with that than dealing with the unknown on the other side. Now, of course, he could be replaced with a better Kang. You have, like, in the comics, like Immortus, and I think there's another one, like a younger version of him called like Iron Lad. And again, He Who Remains, he was when I say good, I just mean is not as evil as Kang the Conqueror, but we don't know how many versions exactly there would be of Kang. We just know that this is the one who did win. And killing him would literally just do the same thing that Sylvie just did at the end of Loki. Now you may say, well, they don't have to kill him. They could just, I don't know, send him to some type of multiversal jail or something like that to subdue him. And I would say that's valid, but you have to think also, if he's currently over the TVA, and he's no longer procuring or making sure that there's a sacred timeline, then the TVA may not have do the or prune the right people or prune the right things, and then you could again create more timelines as well, and then you can have one Kang in jail or one Kang subdued, but then there's another Kang the Conqueror right behind them that's even worse or just doing the same thing. So you're not really solving the problem. So I think realistically, the only way to really beat Kang is either A, he has to get bored and just want to give that responsibility or a job up to someone else who's hopefully, morally good, or B, there's an older or another version of Kang, like I mentioned before, there's another Kang variant called like Immortus or something like that, but have a better version of Kang who just decides that he doesn't want any bad versions of himself to exist, so he's able to kind of manipulate the timeline even in a future state just to make sure that there are no bad Kang variants. But either way, the Avengers are going to have their hands full dealing with Kang, especially with someone who can travel at will through the entire multiverse or a timeline, whatever you want to call it. So I'm interested to see how they handle this. But I believe having Kang win at this point will actually strengthen the MCU and make sure they have different consequences when they go through different battles or different issues. Because as soon as Sylvie killed He Who Remains in the Loki series, she basically single-handedly became responsible for Kang the Conqueror taking over in the first place. So that'll be still exciting to see. And like I said, I'm still, optimistic about what they do with the Kang Dynasty movie and the Secret Wars films. I think they'll still do some interesting and fun things with it. Like again, as I said, I'm sure it'll be fun. I just don't like it. I just tend not to like it as a storytelling element for a huge universe like we have now. But that's what they're paid to figure out, right? But what are you listening to me for anyway? I'm a casual. Cue the outro.